Here's a little update as we get started on Unit 6. I want to briefly revisit some of the stuff from John Hattie and his work on visible learning. And while I'm on the topic, I would highly recommend that if you want to read more about Hattie and his work, you look at his second book, which is called Visible Learning for Teachers. I know that's been mentioned before, but it's a much better read. It actually goes into exactly how teachers can implement some of those 138 different strategies that Hattie talks about in his study, and it's just a much cleaner read. I'd like to caution you that as you look at Hattie's stuff, you don't let his style get in the way of his message. That's kind of easy to do because, as I'm sure a lot of you will agree, he comes across as a bit haughty, a bit arrogant in his video presentations. It's probably easy for him to feel quite heady about his work. He's been highly acclaimed. He's been flown in by lots of governments around the world. He is very much revered as a guru right now in educational research. Sometimes just vocabulary, as we've discussed before, can be a barrier to understanding studies like Hattie's. For example, he uses the term direct instruction in there, and if you look up the effect size, you'll see that it's extremely high. But you need to read deeper into Hattie to understand what he means when he talks about direct instruction. It's almost certainly not going to be the same thing that you've grown up believing that direct instruction was. And you'll find that to be the case with several things. We all know by now that he advocates feedback as a really important ingredient, and it has a really high effect size. But it's not enough to just see that and then go to a faculty and say, okay, research shows that feedback's really important, so let's start giving feedback. You have to really read with some depth to find out what kind of feedback, what's the timeliness of the feedback. Lots of different things about that. A couple of you have brought up in the discussion forums the work of Carol Dweck. That's D-W-E-C-K, along those lines. She is wonderful. She's currently at the University of Stanford, but she has been at Harvard and can't remember off the top of my head right now, but another Ivy school. And she has become the leading expert in the world right now on the growth mindset. And a little later, I'm going to include a little YouTube video of her talking about that because she really has refined the art of giving compliments or giving praise, if it would be a better term, down to a science. And I want you to have exposure to that if you have not already. Go back to Hattie for a minute. His remarks about class size really ticked a few of you off, and I even read some things. I'm chuckling because I could tell you were just fired up. And I read some things from you such as, well, I don't really care what Hattie's study says. I know from my experience that class size makes a difference. Well, you know, it's very easy for us to internalize things like that. I have done it for most of my professional career as well. And I think it behooves us to recognize when something comes along that is special and when it is so important as far as research that we need to step back and look at it in a more objective way. What did Hattie really conclude about class size? Well, he admitted that reducing class size can have positive effects. What he really said was, but it has not been shown to have such dramatic effects as several other things on my list. Now, some political leaders who were, candidly trying to spend less money on public education, not just in the United States, but in some other areas of the world, brought Hattie in as an expert witness to talk about class size. And then they would say to their patrons, you see, this world-renowned researcher supports the fact that we don't need to be spending all our money on reducing class size. That is a poor choice to use Hattie's research in that fashion, in my opinion. He never gave us permission to just let class size get as big as we want to. That's not what he said. So once again, I would encourage you to read a little deeper if you're really interested in what John Hattie really said about class size. I used to say in the Lewis Palmer School District, we're guilty of being hooked on a feeling. And it wasn't always the most popular thing for me to say, but I based it on an old song that I remembered from the 1970s by B.J. Thomas, I'm Hooked on a Feeling. And to some extent, I thought we were. We were doing very well. On most tests, we would be in the top 5 in the state. We should have been with the clientele with which we were working, as I've mentioned to you before. And sometimes we would just rest on our laurels and we would not look at best practice, or we wouldn't even consider changing our own practice because we were doing so well. And I think that's a great error, and it is so far from that notion of being first learner that I think we all need to reevaluate ourselves as knowers if we get to that stance. If we get to a point where we just think we know because of our own experience, we have to just be a little more humble and realize our own experience pales in comparison with the sheer size of Hattie's meta-analysis. By the time he wrote his second book, Visible Learning for Teachers, he had incorporated well over 850 meta-analyses into this huge project that he was working on. Now, certainly, all of us, if we'll just calm down a little bit and think about it, all of us would agree that even though we have experiences and they are real, and some of us have done it for a number of years, that pales in comparison with the number of students and teachers that Hattie's study looks at. So, I promise you I won't keep preaching to you about him. I know some of you are very much done with that, but I would like you to keep an open mind to it. You're probably going to hear and see more about him in the future. What I would like to talk to you about for a few minutes here is a brand new book. It came out last winter, and in fact I read it at the same time I was teaching this class online last winter. And it's by one of my favorites, Michael Fullan, as you know, and it's called The Principle: 3 Keys to Maximizing Impact. Well, there's that word impact, and guess what? This book almost perfectly aligns with our textbook, Unmistakable Impact by Jim Knight. That should not be a surprise to us. As you might remember, Fullan actually wrote the foreword to our textbook. Well, early in his new book, Fullan says that he wants us to consider a new vision of the principalship. It's very much in line with what we've been learning from Jim Knight. And he says that this principle has been evolving for quite some time. He traces its roots to people like Rick DeFore, Doug Reeves, all of the others that we've kind of read and heard about who preach, if you will, collaboration as a style. Now, Fullan contends that right now we're at a watershed moment in education. He is citing things like Senate Bill 191 in Colorado. He's saying there is a lot of pressure put on principals to behave in a certain way right now. He likens it to a period during the late 1980s that he called the instructional period. That happens to have been the time when I entered into school leadership, and that was the first era in which we started using the term instructional leader. Fullan says now there's a really concerted effort to force principals to be in classrooms all the time and more or less define their role by how they do that, by how they supervise instruction. And Fullan is very disdainful of that practice when it's carried to an extreme, and he actually calls it micromanaging in his book. However, as always with Michael Fullan, he's optimistic and he thinks we can actually use this period of time as a springboard to growth in the principalship. For some time, he has written about wrong choices and right choices in terms of educational policy being driven. He points out that we almost always feel pressure as educators in this era. The politics, the economics of education has become such that most of us, from superintendents down through the rank and file to classroom teachers, even to teacher assistants, feel that pressure. And he goes on to say that urgency can push us on course or it can push us off course. It's going to be determined by how we react. There's kind of a neat little chart in the book where he talks about wrong drivers versus right drivers. And 4 prime examples. He doesn't think it's good to let accountability be a driver if by accountability we mean we're going to sort and select teachers identify roughly 5 to 10% of them as poor and fire them. He thinks if that's a primary function as a driver, that's wrong. He thinks the right way to approach that is to build capacity in our schools, the kind of things that Knight has encouraged us to do. Let's get everybody better. Let's go into it fully believing that people can get better. Now, you and I know, and when we've talked about little nuances in the book, like the ability to say no, we do know that there's a certain segment of any population, and teachers are no exception, that are always going to be naysayers. They're always going to object. They're always going to be blockers. Well, Fullen is not naive to that, and at some point those people probably need to be counseled or more forcefully removed from the profession. But if we go into it with the mindset that we're going to grow and improve, Fullen would assert that that is a far more healthy and positive way to lead a school. He thinks a wrong driver is to look at this as individual solutions. In other words, we're going to improve education in the United States one teacher at a time by evaluating them and writing summatives and making them do SMART goals and, on and on and on. He says a better way to move schools is through a collaborative effort where we're doing it with grade levels, with content teams, with middle school teams, with high school departments, with schools, with school districts, but that we're working on far more synergy in that way than we are when we look at just individuals. He also thinks we've had too much emphasis in goal setting, in putting technology as a goal. And if your schools are like the ones that I worked in most of my career, what we're mostly doing with technology is acquiring more stuff. We acquire more hardware. We acquire more bandwidth. We get more pieces of software. And it's kind of ironic that there have not been studies that would indicate that more technology equals more achievement. And it's sort of funny how we continue to spend. Now, Fullen would say that a more appropriate driver would be a new pedagogy that looks at a partnering approach between teachers and students, where the teacher is more facilitator, and then technology finds its rightful place as a tool within that. Some of the stuff that's really on the cutting edge right now, you may have heard about flipped classrooms. It was kind of developed, as a matter of fact, in Woodland Park, Colorado. But flipped classrooms, for those of you who may not know, means that if you want kids to watch a lesson or watch a video, have them do that at home and then spend the time you have in class working together on outcomes or on projects, on problems. And the advocacy of that is that that's a far better way to spend time together than lecturing and watching videos and so forth. There's a lot of promise in that kind of thinking. But once again, you can't let technology be the goal there. It's a tool to flip a classroom. Fullen thinks we're very guilty, especially in this country, of fragmented strategies. We have different teams within a school going different ways. We have different schools within a district going different ways. We certainly have 176 districts in Colorado going different ways. Think how many we have going different ways throughout the country. And he thinks we need to advocate more toward what he calls systemness. And he's been writing about this for a long time. I was privileged to attend a 5-day conference with him back in the 1980s, and he was talking about this same thing, that we need to have a system. And yes, we can have autonomy within that system, but there need to be some common and very much agreed upon collaborative goals to drive the system. I want you to just take a look at these little slides that I put together that kind of illustrate that. We can have random acts of improvement in a school, for example. Let's just take it at the school level. And they're all good in and of themselves. They all come with great intent, but they are not aligned toward anything specifically. So you might have 5th grade embarking on some kind of literacy approach, and maybe 6th grade, if you have K through 6 elementary, is doing something entirely different. That might be one example. You might have a writing model that's used in the primary grades and it's not used in the intermediate grades. You might have some science teachers who are very much using an inquiry-based model, and you might have some others that are still using a more text and lecture type model. So I would just call those random acts of improvement. And the question at the top, what do we get with random acts of improvement? We get a dubious impact. Sometimes we're not even sure if what we've done caused anything. Now, if instead of doing that, we start by placing goals toward which we will all aim, and of course, Knight would call that a target, and he would simplify it to a one-page target. We've talked about how it doesn't have to be exactly one page. We've talked about how some of our bureaucracies require us to have more complex goals than that. But at any rate, we need to have some goals. And then we need to compress those, if I could use that term, with things like our vision and beliefs and our core values. Now, those are concepts that are taught in the course, The Principleship. I have taught that course in the past. I'm not currently teaching it, but I'll bet if you've had it, you talk quite a bit about vision and beliefs and core values. If you haven't had it, you can look forward to getting that exposure to those concepts there. Then you have different systems and processes around that model. And then you start putting aligned acts of improvement. In other words, if we're going to do something, it's going to be toward that target, or we're not going to do it. So as you get into a system with processes like that, then you get toward an unmistakable impact. Not a dubious impact, but an unmistakable impact, which is just exactly what Knight describes to us. Now, Fullen's three keys toward that are, number one, leading learning, learning leader, or lead learner, whatever term you want to use. Certainly, we have become very familiar with that. Number two, being a district and system player. And number three, becoming a change agent. Let's take a quick look at those. That lead learner, we've looked at that quite a bit. It takes great pains to cite specific research in this part of the book. Fullen does. He takes great pains, I should say. Here's a quote. Time devoted to building the capacity of teachers to work in teams is far better spent than time devoted to observing individual teachers. That's from DeFore and Marzano's collaborative effort in 2009. It's a great read, by the way, for those of you who are looking for something. Another quote from that part is from Fullen himself. A narrow focus on instructional leadership and student achievement can shut out other dimensions of lead learning. Being deeply passionate can lead to blind spots if you become overbearing. Well, that kind of flies in the face of what we're being told by our own legislature and to some extent by our own State Department of Education. Fullen concludes that in the current climate, it's easy to go overboard on instructional leadership. Wow, I'm not sure I'm really supposed to be presenting that in a course called Instructional Leadership, but I hope you get the importance here. Principals need to be specifically involved in instruction so that they are knowledgeable about its nature and importance. But if they try to run the show down to the last detail, it will have a very brief run on Broadway indeed. He says that on page 42 of his book. He also points to the phenomenon of giving principals more autonomy in exchange for delivering more accountability as a failed concept. We went through this in Colorado. Our legislature was very intent on bringing this model forward to us several years ago, and the model was actually kind of refined in Toronto, Canada. And the whole idea was we'll give principals a lot of autonomy if they will really up the ante on evaluating their teachers, and they'll get rid of the bad ones and they'll really perform more like a business. Now, as I said, we do have some of that thinking in Colorado, but it's even more prevalent in other parts of the country. Fullen makes the point that not many schools have the capacity in the first place to do this. They don't have the capacity to be their own entity, their own business, if you will. Individual autonomy of schools is no more a solution than individual autonomy of teachers, he tells us on page 42. Now, he's very bold in predicting that principals in states like ours and Tennessee, where we've really gone to this high-stakes evaluation model, will either burn out or learn to go through the procedures superficially. Wow. Pretty powerful statement. They're either going to burn out or they're going to learn to play the game. He goes on to say, on that same page, a good idea becomes an odious task. There's only one thing worse than having to carry out an odious task, and that is having to supervise those carrying out such tasks. The cure becomes the disease, and it is ruining the principalship. Chief among the problems with these new accountability measures is that there is nothing in the strategy about developing the group. It's as if the system has unlimited supervisory capacity and that principals have all the time in the world to change teachers one at a time. I locked onto this because when I was out in the field doing research for this course 3 years ago, that was the overriding concern, and it remains the overriding concern. And I'm not just talking about rookie principals. I'm talking about seasoned, qualified, well-established principals. They still don't know where they're going to find the time to do the job the way it's being redefined by some bureaucrats. But lest you think that Fullen is thrown in the towel, he concludes that chapter by writing, "The good news is that ideas are emerging that could make the principal's job less complex, less distracting, and yes, more instructionally effective for all. It's time to change the channel. A new, more powerful role, that of the principal as lead learner, is becoming clear." Now in chapter 2, he cites one researcher after another in building his case that groups of teachers working together in purposeful ways will produce greater learning in more students. He cautions, however, that collaborative groups have to have a specific and focused link to student achievement in order to be effective. He talks about 3 types of capital that need to be developed in schools. The first one is human capital, experience and qualifications of individual teachers. Now, one of my favorite authors that I've mentioned to you before, Todd Whitaker, would say there are only 2 ways to improve your schools: hire better teachers or improve the ones you have. He's very blunt when he writes in that fashion. I think that's a little bit simplistic, but I also buy into most of that. It's very important that we have quality teachers, but it's probably even more important that we improve the ones we have. Social capital, working with collaborative teams of teachers in a way focused at student achievement. Most of us call that PLCs. Knight will have a different term. Your school may have a different term. 3, decisional capital, the knowledge, resources, and energy required to put human and social capital to work. Principals need it, but in great schools it abides even more in other individuals and in teams. You might remember that Knight likes the term designer for the principal. So the principal, as part of the decisional capital function, is going to design ways to put these teams together with their resources for the good of kids. Now, I don't know about you, most of you, not every one of you, is wanting to become a school principal. And if I were back there in that stage of my career and I was looking forward, I think I would find a lot more excitement and reward, and even more important, benefit for my students in looking at this model that Knight and Fullen are describing than in that traditional grinded out approach of let's get in those classrooms, let's whip up on the bad teachers, and let's just keep doing that over and over again until our schools are good. My intent here was simply to reassure you, and maybe to some extent myself, that this concept of instructional leader emerging more as lead learner is taking hold and does have promise. It's not just an isolated thing with some wacky professor from the University of Kansas. Fullen's book is only 160 pages long, but it's really good stuff. I don't like to require students to purchase a lot of books, and so I did not require you to have 2 textbooks, but I'm still considering doing that in the future. So if any of you want to take these concepts that we've been discussing to a further level, this is an easy book to pick up. It's relatively cheap. You can get it on Amazon, and you can read it easily in a weekend. Thanks for your attention.